Katie's just, we have some precious minutes, so Katie's going to do some introductions, and we're going to hand it over to our colleague, Dr. Malik Henfield, who will lead the session. And we appreciate Dr. Malik Henfield, who's the Dean of the Institute for Racial Justice here at Loyola. We appreciate his support and collaboration in this event. So, Katie, please.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Dr. Henfield, for moderating this discussion. I have the great privilege of introducing our panelists for our first session. This panel will be about the role of historical scholarship in the work of restorative justice. And today we have the great privilege of having three scholars. We have Dr. Adam Rothman, who will be joining us from Zoom. Dr. Rothman is a professor in the History Department and director of Georgetown Center for the Study of Slavery and its Legacies. Hello, Dr. Rothman. We also have Dr. Elsa Mendoza, who's here with us in person. Dr. Mendoza is the Associate Professor of History at Middlebury College, and her research focuses on the lives of people enslaved at universities, as well as the financial connections between slavery and higher education in the United States. And then last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Leslie Harris. Dr. Harris is a professor of history and African American studies at Northwestern University and is a specialist in pre-Civil War African American history. With that, I welcome Dr. Mendoza, Dr. Harris, and Dr. Henfield to the stage.
It's early in the morning.
Yes, it is early in the morning.
Testing. Here we go. Good morning, everyone. So glad to be here with this vibrant crowd here at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Friday morning.
Yes, no less.
Kudos to you. Let's give yourselves. Again, as mentioned earlier, my name is Malik Henfield. I'm the founding dean of the Institute for Racial Justice here at Loyola, also a professor in the School of Education. All I can say is I'm looking forward to the conversation. If it's anything like the prep call, where I learned so much in 30 minutes, I'm excited for all of you. And let's dive right in, but before doing so, I'd like to share how this is going to work. So we're going to have a conversation, and it really is meant to be a conversation for 45 minutes, and then we're going to transition to about 30 minutes of Q&A where we can hear from all of you. Sounds good?
Sounds good.
All right, let us begin. First question. This is about your personal journeys and context. Could you share your journey into this field, including any pivotal experiences? What specific social or societal university context influenced your work? So anything that happened in the world during that time when you first got into this work at your universities, put it into context.
So who wants to go first?
Why don't you start?
Well, I will start then, from right to left or whatever. I've never been good at right to left. Well, I was actually a student, a graduate student at Georgetown University when it became part of the national news, thanks to someone that is here today and needs no introduction, about Georgetown's connections to enslavement and that Georgetown University's leaders had sold more than 300 people. So as a poor graduate student, I was actually hired to be a graduate assistant and to try to unearth stories, try to find in the archives stories of people who had been enslaved by the Jesuits. And for me, one of the most striking parts of the archival work was finding the names of individuals, to finding their stories. And in particular, I remember looking at sacramental records and finding in a person's baptisms or in a person's marriage the fact that they were described by the priest, by Jesuits, as property of the college. How at the same time that someone was being joined in the sacrament of marriage or was being baptized, that they were detailed as property was something that really struck me, and that was actually, I think, a defining moment of my career as a scholar. Before that, I admit I wasn't ready to dive completely on this and actually, become a researcher on it. So for me, that was really a defining moment and a defining experience. And doing the research now for many years, I don't wanna start counting, but it was several years that it took me to finish my dissertation, which was actually on the people who were enslaved at Georgetown College, not at the Jesuit plantations, but at the same school, that I decided that this was something worthwhile to think, especially as a student, that I was walking perhaps the same spaces, at least the same streets, since the streets at Georgetown University are quite old, and occupying the same spaces as the people who were enslaved, so that other individuals could receive a Jesuit education, was something that I take with me, and I actually have in my office, tape copies of some of the sacramental records that I find. And I look at them often as I'm writing my book. So that is how I ended up immersed in this world and why I am continuing to do this research.
That's beautiful, thank you. I backed into this work. I had just gotten tenure at Emory when the contested election between George W. Bush and Al Gore happened, ending up with the Supreme Court electing George W. Bush. And at that moment, I looked up at the federal government and I said, nothing I can do up there. And I said internally to myself, I just gotten tenure, whatever activism I might want to do. And I had no idea what I was saying to myself because I'm a professor, I write books. I didn't know what that meant. I guess I'll just have to figure out how to do something local if I want to make a difference around these issues. And I think I was thinking of traditional history stuff that we do, making sure that we have a diverse professoriate by advising undergraduates and graduates who want to go to graduate school, continuing my work in African American history, which focuses on the history of slavery. But a few years later at Emory, we had a year of racial strife, a year literally from fall through spring of racial incidents that went from anti-Black racism to charges of anti-Semitism. And it was one of the most difficult years any of us who had been at Emory had ever had, including people who had been there much longer than I. A small group of us began to meet, and we didn't agree at all that there was a problem or what a solution should be. But we began discussing, as my friends who called the group, who became my friends who called the group, said, what's the data? How do we know that Emory, this incredibly diverse school by the numbers, has a race problem or a diversity problem? And we began talking over that year. It was a changing group, but there were a few of us who stayed the whole time. And by the end of the year, as things continued to be difficult, we called on each other to discuss what was happening. It was transformative for all of us. So those who had been skeptical at the beginning really heard those of us who saw and experienced more than they did because we were people of color, because we were women. We took that experience, two of us, a colleague of mine and I, and created what we called the Transforming Community Project, which was an understanding that university communities are constantly changing. And as I used to say, do you want to be whipped by that change? Or do you want to be conscious of the change and be responsive institutionally? And our method, we wanted that year that we had, we wanted to give that opportunity to others in the community, faculty, staff, students, and alums. We created community dialogues where people met over a meal every other week during the course of the semester. They were peer-facilitated groups, they were diverse groups, and they talked about the history of race at Emory, how it related to the nation, and by the end, we asked them to think about what actions they could take. And I always said it could be as small as having a coffee with a colleague who you've never had a discussion about race with. That brought me into that. We launched that in 2005, which turned out to be the same time frame in which Brown launched its, or I can't remember if it launched it or if it published its study on slavery and race at Brown. And so suddenly we were part of this larger group. A few years later, 2011, 2010, with colleagues from Brown and from the University of Alabama, which was the first school to have an apology for slavery. My colleagues, Jim Campbell and Al Brophy, we organized the first international conference on slavery in the university. We just sent out a call for papers. We had no idea who else was doing the work, largely. We received enough proposals to have a 2.5-day conference with multiple sessions. We had no idea how many other schools were doing this work as well. Individuals, mostly individuals who felt moved. And when I think about that, and I still believe this, sometimes you end up in a moment of change and you're not even aware that everyone around you is also entering that moment of change with you. It was certainly inspired in part by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa and ongoing Truth and Reconciliation Commissions as genocides. I'm thinking about Rwanda, of course. But it was really, at the time, and I still think today, it was one of the most emotionally moving experiences I've had as an academic. It really allowed me to think about my academic work, not simply as head work, but as heart work.
Thank you. Dr. Rothman.
So I want to, first let me just start by thanking Loyola University Chicago, Dr. Henfield, the organizers of this event for giving me the opportunity to be here with you even virtually. It is not the same as being there in person, and I wish I could be there in person, but my teaching obligations keep me here at Georgetown today. But it's a real honor to join this panel with people I admire greatly and have learned so much from, Dr. Harris and Dr. Mendoza. And it's a special pleasure always to be on a panel with Dr. Mendoza, since we worked together when she was at Georgetown. And I feel very proud to see where she's taken her work. So with that preface, let me tell you a little bit about my journey into the Slavery Memory and Reconciliation Initiative at Georgetown. So I'm a historian of American slavery, and I have taught the subject at Georgetown since 2000. So I've been at Georgetown almost 25 years now. In 2015, I had the opportunity to join Georgetown University's working group on slavery memory and reconciliation. That working group was charged by the president of our university, Jack DeGioia, with examining our school's historical ties to slavery and making a set of recommendations to the university about how we could acknowledge that history. And for me, that experience was really transformative, and it has changed the way, it has changed what I research and how I research it. It has changed what I teach and how I teach it, and I think has also had a powerful effect on the whole Georgetown University community. So it's been very important. And I think one of the things I want to emphasize, since this is a panel that's about the role of historical scholarship, is the idea that Georgetown's history of slavery had not been a secret. It had not been hidden away before 2015. Scholars had been writing about it for 100 years, including Jesuit scholars. And my predecessor at Georgetown, Emmett Curran, in his multi-volume bicentennial history of the university, had written about Georgetown's ties to slavery and the infamous 1838 sale of the community that we now know as the GU 272. And in fact, there had been a whole program around this history, a whole curriculum around this history in the American Studies program at Georgetown in the 1990s, going into the first years of this century. But when the working group started and began to disseminate its findings and this information about Georgetown's ties to slavery, it came as a shock and a revelation to most people around the university community. You know, most people had no idea that the university had this history, even though our school colors are blue and gray with everything that entails. So for me, that was a lesson in the gap between things that are not a secret, but things that are not widely known. And this is something I have to say I learned from the historian Craig Wilder as well, who wrote this extremely important book, Ebony and Ivy, about the Ivy League's historical ties to slavery. That was one of the really foundational texts for us on Georgetown's working group as we started our work. So we learned from Professor Wilder, we learned from what Professor Harris and her colleagues had done at Emory and colleagues had done at Brown. So, we weren't starting from scratch. But we were starting from a point where there already was quite a bit of historical scholarship about our history. There were still a lot of stories to be unearthed and told, and that is something that Professor Mendoza, I think, is engaged in now. But it struck me that one of our most important obligations was to try to teach and communicate the history that you could find in the scholarship more effectively to the university community and the broader public. So that's something we've been trying to do ever since then, and we can talk more about that. So for me, just as a member of that working group, and we could talk more about why that working group was launched in 2015. It was an important moment both for the university and also for national politics with the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. But one of the things that happened over the course of the academic year that the working group was in effect, 2015, 2016, was that an alumnus of the university, Richard Cellini, started a project to track down the living descendants of the people owned and sold by the Maryland Jesuits in 1838. And you've heard from Rachel Swarns, and you've learned about the emergence of that GU 272 descendant community. But for me, beginning to work with members of the descendant community was the pivotal moment in my experience as a scholar, doing work on this history to try to translate this history to the broader university community. And I think for me, it was the experience of sitting in Georgetown's archives with descendant families, working through the kinds of sacramental records that Professor Mendoza was talking about, where they could see the names of their own ancestors, and working through not just the sacramental records, but the bills of sale, property records that recorded their ancestors as chattel. So sitting in those archives with descendants, thinking through these archival materials and their implications today was extremely powerful. It was a way of encountering history that I had never, in a way that I never encountered it before as a fully academic kind of scholar. And there are two things I just want to say about that. One is that it was clear that this history mattered to descendant families in a really profound way. And to be able to help them work through that history was a great privilege for me, a real honor. But also, and this relates to something Professor Harris said, it was a deeply emotional experience, incredibly bittersweet, with the whole range of emotions like flowing through those rooms of sadness and anger, and even certain strands of joy at being able to learn a history that had previously been unknown. And I was not prepared as an academic for those kinds of emotions to shape the work that I was involved in. So that has been a tremendous learning experience, and I really have the descendants that I've worked with to thank for that. So that's my journey.
Well, I can speak a bit in terms of the things that are widely known, but, or that some scholars know, but oh my, sorry for the echo. My voice is horrible already, and then you have to suffer through the echo.
It's the technology, Elsa.
No. But what I would say is, for example, as a scholar that was also trained in the history of Latin America, for me it was no surprise that the Society of Jesus had enslaved individuals all across the Americas, way before the Jesuits had even arrived at the shores of Maryland. So for me, it was quite striking to see the surprise, because as a person that, for example, is of Mexican origin, the whole idea that the Society of Jesus had used enslaved individuals to create their schools was something that I had learned quite young. So the whole surprise for me was actually surprising, and it speaks to how there's issues with our historical memory and what we try to preserve, what we try to speak about, and how important it is for institutions to reckon with their history and to actually do full accounting of this history. Because in the case, again, of the Society of Jesus, their history of enslavement goes beyond Georgetown University. It goes beyond St. Louis University. It is a history that goes across continents and that has enslaved thousands of individuals across multiple continents, which is, I think, something that needs to be reckoned with and that needs to be put into context, which is also why it's so important to have these events. So that's, part of the context there in terms of things that, some of us know, but everyone should know, then that we need to talk about.
I can also speak to 2015 and also talk about my president and why he became a champion of the work we did. If I'm remembering right, that was also a time of student protests, and certainly students in that moment were sitting in on campuses in a lot of places, and they were directly talking about inequities in the university. The reason that my president really got behind us when we presented him with this idea was that he had arrived on campus literally weeks. He had the shortest honeymoon of any president I'd ever seen on a college campus, although that is up for debate this past year. But he arrived on campus and suddenly everything just went bananas with the first racial incident, which I won't recount here, and he just was in the crosshairs, of our problems that whole year. One of the things that he said towards the end of that year, he needed to hire a provost, and he hired Earl Lewis specifically because Earl was someone who had been at Michigan, had been involved with the Michigan affirmative action cases, and was deeply knowledgeable about racial diversity in higher education. And when Earl came to campus in July 1st, I think I was there July 3rd, saying, hey, I got this crazy idea, and Earl funded it. But I would say that as terrible as it sounds, this distinction between what everyone kind of knows or is out there versus when it gets activated and when people become active, and often from the ground up, sadly. The top down is often looking to quell dissent. But those of us at the bottom who are suffering, at a certain point, you hit that boil. And certainly we have seen that over and over and over again in the 2000s, out in the world as well as on our campuses. And so that is, sadly, disruption is what drives historical change. I've been thinking about that a lot this past year. The role of disruption and violence, frankly, as a slavery scholar, examining slave rebellions. How do I think about that? How do I teach that now in our current context? But even to a lesser degree, what does it mean when college students are confronted with inequities, which is true in 2015 and true in the last year, and how do they respond to that as young people, as young activists trying to make change?
I'm in the flash.
Dr. Roth.
So this is,
Did you
I
get
guess
the
what,
question?
oh, tell me the question again.
Okay. I was curious about, you mentioned things that are not a secret, but not widely known. And I was hoping that you could explore a little bit with us 2015, and you mentioned your president really championing this work. What was it about 2015 that kind of pushed this person forward?
Yeah, thanks. A number of things came together in 2015 to make an opportune moment at Georgetown to look at our history. The first, and I mentioned this already, was the national political context. Just months before Michael Brown had been killed in Ferguson, Missouri, sparking the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. There had been the massacre at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, by a white supremacist, kind of further accelerating the urgency of that moment. Protests were beginning to break out around college campuses under the banner of Black Lives Matter, I think beginning at the University of Missouri. So that was going on. At the same time, there was a local story, kind of a local consideration at Georgetown, where a couple of things were happening. One was that a student journalist for our college newspaper named Matthew Quallen in the 2014-15 academic year had written a series of articles about the Maryland Jesuits and slavery and their connections to Georgetown. So he began to put this issue on the horizon, on the consciousness of a lot of students, especially around Georgetown. So this is one of those areas where students really made a decisive impact on raising consciousness around his history. And then Georgetown had just renovated a residential hall that was named Milady Hall. Thomas Milady, was one of the chief architects of the 1838 sale of the GU 272. Now, President DeJoy knew this history, and I think he also understood the moment that we're in. And I think the confluence of all of these things led him to organize the working group to try to provide some leadership for the Georgetown community as it connected the past and the present. Just one more thing I want to add about that is that just to reinforce this idea of the importance of students, it was not just Matthew Quallen writing those articles in the Hoy, although he was very important. There were students on the working group who were extremely important to the work and to translating the work of the working group to the student body at Georgetown. There were student activists beyond the working group, including and some on the working group who led protests on campus that connected issues in the past of slavery and Jim Crow on campus with present issues of racism and the campus climate. And students were very activated around this history, and in the fall of 2015 actually sat in the president's office to try to accelerate the pace of change at the university. And one of the things that they did accelerate was the changing of the names of two buildings on campus named after the architects of the 1838 sale, including Milady Hall. So now Milady Hall is named Isaac Hawkins Hall. And Isaac Hawkins was a member of the GU 272, and he, in fact, is the person who is listed at the top of the Articles of Agreement between Thomas Milady and the purchasers in Louisiana. So his name kind of symbolizes the whole GU 272 community, but he was actually a real person, an individual, the patriarch of a large family at the White Marsh Plantation. So that's just one small way in which the landscape of historical memory has changed at Georgetown as a consequence of this process.
Thanks so much. What I'm hearing is this theme, obviously, of student activation and the influence that they have on so many impactful moments in universities throughout history. I'm curious if you could share a little bit more about the faculty perspective and things that individual faculty can do, relate to your personal experience as well as what you've seen throughout history and your work and experiences that can perhaps expose students to some of the work that you're working on and help them understand exactly what they can do with the power that they have, whether that be teaching, research, or community engagement.
Yeah, I think there's the role of historical scholarship in putting the information out there so that students can see the information, see the documents. For example, in the case of Adam and I at Georgetown, we were contributors to the Georgetown Slavery Archive. Today, on your phones, if anyone wants to take it out right now, they can see some of the documents from the history of enslavement at Georgetown University and at the Jesuit plantations. And just putting the information out there is important. I also think making students knowledgeable of the power that they have within the institution is part of helping people reckon with this history. It is not just a coincidence that in some of the cases that we have spoken about, student activism has been quite important to push change and making people knowledgeable of this history in the classroom. For example, I teach now at an institution that is not a Jesuit institution. It is not a religiously affiliated institution. And it is actually an institution in the state of Vermont where, people in New England believe that they had nothing to do with enslavement. But that's, what they think. And then they walk into my classroom and they learn otherwise. And the surprise in people's faces when they learn that there were people enslaved in Boston, or that even in Burlington, Vermont, you could have found an enslaved individual at a certain period of time, like making people know this history and own this history and want to reckon with this history, I think is part of the role of historical scholarship. So just like putting that information out there so that people know what to do with it, and so that we lift this veil of ignorance that sometimes we use to protect ourselves because it is quite comfortable. And that is, I think, part of the role of historical scholarship as well.
At Emory, what we did, we had, as part of the Transforming Community Project, we had summer pedagogy workshops that built on patterns that we had already had at Emory. And we paid them generously to come and spend about a week and a half with us learning about Emory's racial history broadly and the history of slavery. And then they had to either adapt a syllabus they already used or create a whole new syllabus based on that history. Now, we had no control and didn't want to on whether or not they actually taught it, but many people did. My favorite outcome from that was the PE teacher who created a running path for his PE students that went back the historical sites of slavery on the early campus at Emory. And so that was probably the most original and creative way to incorporate history into a course that usually is not, I don't know if it's even thought of as it's all about the physical body, but you're running past these places. So just to say that we opened up a space for faculty to think creatively about what it meant to take this history seriously. The other thing I'll say about that workshop and about the work we did for faculty is that I have a very clear sense that for some faculty, it became an opportunity to find their voices around racial diversity in the institution and other issues. And I'll never forget going to a faculty senate meeting and seeing one of my colleagues. She didn't have the answer for the issue, but she was raising the question. She's like, there's something wrong with this plan around racial diversity. I'm not sure. She was French. I'm not sure what it is, but I think we need to attend. And she just kept saying it. And that sounds small, but it was actually huge in the context. I knew that she was someone who wanted to do more, and she had just decided that she was going to take on this work in the university. So that's beyond the classroom, but of course faculty can have enormous influence. So that's the other piece of going through a process, but also being part of a community that goes through a process where the community has agreed that this is important, that people find their voice in a different way.
Dr. Rothman?
I think I've been so inspired by my colleagues at Georgetown and other places who have been able to both research and teach their institutional histories of slavery in the most incredibly creative kinds of ways. I think a few things. One is that faculty need to learn this history as well. We're not born knowing this, and this is especially true of folks who are not historians, who may not have come across the historical scholarship, in their everyday lives. People don't just run into historical scholarship walking down the street normally. So faculty need training as well. They need resources to help them teach or incorporate this history into their own classes, even if they're not history classes. And I think that leads to another point, which is that, and I always like to say this, I think this history is too important to be left to the historians alone, that there are materials here for philosophers and theologians and people who do business ethics and you name it. I think there are ways of connecting to this history. And Professor Harris's point about the PE teacher developing a running route is a great example. The example that I like to use from Georgetown is I have a brilliant colleague in the music department, Carlos Simon, who's a composer, and he is himself African American and deeply steeped in classical traditions. He composes a wide range of things. But when he first came to Georgetown, he learned about Georgetown's history, and he thought that he had to do something musically that responded to, the Slavery Memory and Reconciliation Initiative. So he joined one of our trips down to Louisiana to visit the plantations where the GU 272 had ended up. He went to the archives and poured through the sacramental records and bills of sale. And he ended up composing a piece that he calls the Requiem for the Enslaved, which honors the GU 272 and all enslaved people in America. And it's this incredible, about 35-minute requiem, coming out of that classical Catholic liturgical tradition, but he updates it in the most remarkable kinds of ways, incorporating spirituals and blues and jazz and hip hop. And he was actually nominated for a Grammy for this piece. I mean, it was just incredibly wonderful. And he was able to perform it at Georgetown and some other places as well. And that's just one example of a truly creative person who's not a historian, but working with history to reveal some truths to people in a way that they might not otherwise grasp it. So that's my example.
Thank you so much. In the time we have remaining, I'd like to turn it over to the audience to engage in the conversation.
Okay, please just raise your hand. You are among friends, and this is a place for dialogue and for being person to person. I'll make one observation as a theologian, because these are some new truths for many of us, uncomfortable in many ways, and the urge might be to kind of cross your arms and maybe close off. But as a theologian, I can say this. If we are tempted to run away from it and live in fear, that's not going to work for anybody. If you turn and go into it, that's where God is. And God is loving. So with that, you can say whatever you'd like, if a question, a comment, you want to push back, you want further clarity, please feel free. And Kate is over there with the microphone.
I can get us started here. So Claire Noonan, I'm the Vice President for Mission Integration here. And you all have already been so personal in talking about your engagement with the study and the action around this issue. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how your own racial identity figured into your way of being able to interact with this story, or maybe prevented you or made it frightening for you to engage with the story deeper. So anyway, just some comment about how your own racial identity interacts with the subject area and your ability to remain active in it.
I can start. Like you, I grew up in the South. I grew up in New Orleans, so slavery, of course, So I always have a kind of, what are people afraid of feeling about it. It's not, and this isn't part of my racial identity, it's just part of my identity. I think I'm very non-reactive, so I very easily answer, interesting, tell me more about why you think this is not, you know what I mean? So I think I invite that. But the other piece that we were very conscious of when we built this Transforming Community project was that this was not something that was only owned by or should be only owned by Black people. And that, for me, very personally, I believe it. I've seen so many Black people in the academy get burned out trying to carry the racial burden of these institutions. And so my own very particular way of moving into this work is that the African American Studies Department, of which I was chair, was not going to bear the burden of this project. People were going to get paid if there was any way that they could get paid to do this work. The other piece, though, that we were very conscious of is that we did have many white people who had been through all kinds of racial reconciliation workshops, movements, you name it. There was actually a lot of resource at Emory, partly because of a theology school there, but also we're in Atlanta. I mean, of course. So it wasn't a matter of, it was a matter of activating it and having permission to do it. My what do I call myself? My co-founder was white, my co-director was white, those are different people. And when we built peer facilitations, they were always intergenerational, hopefully interstatus, like a student and a faculty member, or a staff and a student, or something like that, and interracial, and beyond Black and white also, not simply Black and white. And so we very consciously talked about that and built that. The problem wasn't so much race in terms of the people who came to us and wanted to do the work. I would say the problem is people have to give up status. They have to be uncomfortable. They have to be willing to talk about the conversation. We did our work, the project was in existence formally, have a 5-year window. So if you're on leave 1 year or you're a new student, you have time to enter in. If you're afraid, maybe you'll hear about it from someone else and you have time to join. These projects that we're discussing today at Georgetown and beyond sound like they're more for the life of the institution, like they should not go away. And so I wanted there to be a little bit of a rubber band, if you will, a tight bit, like, if you want to get in, it's going to end. Certainly there were people who hid from that, but having that arc and having the people who participated then go out and say, why don't you do this, et cetera, that created a slight urgency to participate, but also it allowed people to say, oh, maybe I should try that. One more thing I want to say, and this is about silence. In every institution that you're part of, in every community that you're part of, there are uncomfortable things that are hidden. And I can't tell you how many times people said, there was something that wasn't working, I couldn't put my finger on it, but talking about this racial issue, the set of racial issues openly, released. There's so much fear that there will be anger. People are just relieved, like, oh, finally, we don't have to hide it, we don't have to press it down, this is linked to what you said about theology, same thing. So that's, yeah.
Well, I can
Oh,
speak
yes.
a bit about, let's see,
It's
it's on? Okay. I have to admit, initially I was very self-conscious of the fact that, I'm a Hispanic woman and that there were perhaps parts of the story that it wasn't my role to tap into. And that is still, I think, something that I sometimes struggle. What I did lean into in some respects was also my religious identity. I was raised as a Catholic. To be buried in sacramental ground was something that I was taught that, for example, was important. Therefore, to see that enslaved individuals had been buried in sacramental ground and then that sacramental ground had been disrupted at Georgetown was something that struck me quite hard. So I think that in that respect, my religious more than my racial identity shaped part of the work, and it may be perhaps why I'm so fascinated by issues such as access to the sacraments for people who were enslaved by the Jesuits, or their religious practices, and that tension between how can you write that someone was part of the body of Christ and at the same time enslaved and sell them and abuse them. So that is, I think, the part of my personal identity that most shapes my work. And in the case of, again, my racial identity, at some point, I also believe, well, this is something that no matter who you are, if you are a person, if you are a human being, it should be something that matters to you. It doesn't matter. color of your skin or how were you raised. But this is part of our common history as humans. And in the case of people who are affiliated by Jesuit institutions, that is part of your common history as, part of the institution. The institution isn't only its leaders or its past, but it's also the people who make it right now, which I think in the case of Loyola, maybe many of you here in the room. So that is also something that I think about often.
It's a good practice, students. I want to encourage you. You're in a university. This is not a place of perfection, right? Just speak your mind. I want to encourage, yeah, good. Morning.
Hi, my name is Jamie, and I was previously working with Dr. Rothman at Georgetown, and now a history PhD working with Dr. Leslie Harris. And I was curious if you all could speak a little bit about reactions, actions, or initiatives or projects that you saw after teaching undergraduates about the history of slavery, and what kinds of reckonings you were able to see at that level and what kind of impacts that may have had.
Maybe can you hear me? Okay, great. First of all, Damie, great to hear from you, and I can't actually see you, but I can hear you, and that's wonderful, and I hope you're thriving. Just in teaching, I really focused my teaching since 2015-16 on Georgetown's own history and trying to communicate what we know to students and help students work through all of these histories. And the students have helped me to work through the histories as well. One of the things that I've done in my classes is encourage students to produce a kind of wide range of kinds of responses to this history. So some of my students write, analytical research papers, but I've had other students do podcasts and art projects and all sorts of, like even compose music that somehow helps them to process and understand this history, and also to convey it to other people, including maybe their own parents or friends who might not be in these classes, or other kinds of colleagues. So I've seen my students become teachers of these histories in their own communities, and that's been beautiful to behold. I think students at Georgetown have also taken these histories upon themselves in really important political kinds of ways. So the best example of this came in 2019, when students at Georgetown proposed through their student government association a referendum to create a fund that would benefit members of the descendant community. So it was actually a very practical program of material reparation for the descendants of the GU 272. And this was a student-led initiative, including students who were themselves descendants. So it was a really extraordinary kind of collaboration. The students at Georgetown had a very vigorous debate about this referendum for several weeks, and they ended up having a historic vote in favor of establishing a student activity fee that would subsidize something called a reconciliation fund. And it was actually had the highest turnout of any referendum in the history of student government at Georgetown, and the students voted about 2/3 in favor of this plan. So that's an example. I mean, I was not part of this, but I think the students who opposed the referendum were students who had deeply absorbed the history and wanted to do something about it. The mechanism that the students proposed has not come to pass, but there is a reconciliation fund in effect in Georgetown now. And just this week, the latest round of grants totaling about $200,000 went out to a group of descendant-led projects, many of which are actually about educating communities about the history of the GU 272. So that's a very that's a very concrete way that students have both learned and acted upon Georgetown's own history.
I'll just say briefly that some of the students who participated in the Transforming Community Project went on to do work in nonprofits. One became a part of the diplomatic corps. Participating, I think, in that program was a way of, as Adam said, of finding their voice, of thinking about communicating not just this kind of history, but how do you communicate at this level and on multiple registers. And you know, again, I don't have to tell you that I do think that many businesses, many kinds of institutions are going to need people who have a facility with these difficult issues. We need more people who understand both the past but also how it lives in the present, and you know, definitely today. So.
Hi, I'm so thrilled to be at this panel, and one of the things I was interested in hearing you guys talk a little more about was what is known and what is widely known. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm a professor and a journalist at the New York Times. I wrote this story in 2016 about Georgetown and its history. And one of the things that struck me when I was first learning about this history was just that question about, like, why didn't I know? And you know, I learned in the reporting process, obviously, that there were historians. There's a book that had been written by a Jesuit scholar in the early 2000s on the 1838 sale and Jesuit decision-making, that there was a scholar at Georgetown who had written about this article, and as part of this history of Georgetown, earlier Jesuits who had mined into this history. And I just kept thinking to myself, well, why didn't I know? And I think one of the things that I reached out to a scholar at Harvard who has done some work, and I said, again, he asked, why don't I know? He said, it's not an accident that he didn't know. And for me, I think that's really an important thing to think about, is of the ways in which, I think, Elsa, when you mentioned the veil that institutions have, I don't want people to leave this room and think that, well, it's in the archives, it's there are books, and, you know, wow, it just didn't get out there. I think there are decisions that institutions make about what is known and what isn't known. One of the things that struck me was that, yes, all of this was known at Georgetown, but if you looked at Georgetown's website and a description of its history, none of this was there. If you looked at the U.S. Conference of Bishops and the history of the Catholic Church in the United States, none of this was there. If you were, and actually not only that, but you know, there are instances where the information was misconveyed. The Visitation Sisters described their history as, you know, early leaders of championing the education of enslaved girls. When an archivist went into their archives, found no evidence of that. In fact, found evidence of the buying and selling of enslaved girls. So I wonder, one of the things that's encouraging to me now, like, is the efforts to make sure on an institutional level that this information is known. You know, Georgetown now, and maybe Adam can talk about that too, is, you know, has a course where every undergraduate will, you know, learn about the history. I think Loyola Maryland is also trying to do that. So anyway, I'm just wondering about kind of, if you guys can talk about institutional barriers, and then how do we address those?
I'll say, certainly at Emory, it was known long before we began our project. On the back of the alumni magazine, when I first arrived, there was a short article about a woman, an enslaved woman named Kitty, who is central to Emory's slavery history and racial history. I think what changed because of our work, but also because people were willing to change, there was a new history written of Emory that did a lot more rather than simply being celebratory, it really delved into some difficult issues around race, also around gender, was just a much more critical history of the institution. many of these institutions, thinking about their alumni, want you to remember the institution in a fond way. Now, they don't think of me as their alumni who's going to give money, of course, and they don't think of alumni as people who can hold complicated truths. I can love my institution, but also recognize, yeah, you didn't do everything right. That's the world we live in. So we have to sort of, in institutions, build a kind of resilience to their own histories. Not in the individual, I mean, the individuals certainly, but the institutions have to become more resilient in dealing with their history. I want to also say, though, that we're in a nation that is in deep denial. When you said there were slaves in Vermont, there are slaves in every part of this nation, colonial forward. There is native dispossession in every part. It is central, and yet we still struggle as a nation, and even as in the Americas and Europe, to understand that without slavery, we would not be here, period. The wealth of this hemisphere is rooted in slave labor. More enslaved people, if you look at the Americas as a whole, more enslaved people, more people from Africa came, outnumbered like 5 to 1 to Europeans. And it was that labor that extracted the wealth that created what has become the United States and the Americas. But that fact is not well known or well understood, period. So then when you get to an individual institution that you love, of course you're thinking, oh, they couldn't have done that horrible thing. Everything we touch is rooted in that early history of slavery. We would literally not be here, and native dispossession. We're in a moment now where there are people who are trying to remove that history from books, from classrooms, from libraries, and we really have to think about it. Again, I grew up in a place where this was freely available to me. I was a reader, I read about it. It was what happened. But we're in a moment when people don't want to say what happened. And we really are, I think, in a quite treacherous place right now. So I just say that as the work that we have been doing has had an impact, and when there's an impact, there's a backlash. We are definitely in the backlash. So I would, I do think many schools have rewritten their websites now, even since 2015 and 16 when you were writing, Rachel, and have published more accessible things. There are websites, people continue to add to that. There are panels like this everywhere all the time. But we are in a moment when people really want to press that back down again. And we really have to ask ourselves why? Why?
Hi, my name is Jackie Scott. I'm in the philosophy department and I'm chair of the philosophy department. So Dr. Rothman, thank you very much for the shout out to philosophy, and that philosophy needs to weigh in here. I just want to sort of emphasize something that you all have said, and particularly what Dr. Paris said at the end, which is to understand the ways in which epistemologically, fancy philosophy language for knowledge, right? How do we not know things? There's a willfulness to this. Right? And we can talk about a veil, and I want to sort of, yes, it's a veil, but it's a veil that someone puts there and someone keeps there. There's a way in which, again, as Dr. Harris has pointed out, there's a way in which now we are dealing with the backlash, right? And we're afraid, out of fear and ignorance, we want to keep a place of comfort. And the place of comfort comes at the discomfort, and has historically come at the discomfort of many people. So what we need to do is think about, in the here and now, how we can take the history and march it forward. And not just think about, oh, that was in the past. We can sort of reckon with it. The reckoning there is like, I studied it, I know it, oh, that was awful. Okay, we're done, now we're ready to racist, here we go. But to see the way that we continue to be complicit in it, right? And see the way that just focusing on racism, we focus on a lot of other results. But just focus on the way that racism continues to operate in seen and in unseen ways. And often the unseeing, and I'm using ableist language here, is willful. And we need to stop and think about that and not be afraid of dealing with the discomfort. The discomfort is like the discomfort of working out. People pay a lot of money to go to gyms, right? To deal with this. It's a similar discomfort. It's a discomfort of growth. Right? So sorry I got a little soapbox there, but I just wanted to sort of resonate philosophically, right, with some of the things that we are dealing with and the ways that they're connected with some of the history that's going on here. And it needs to be an action item right? For again, using the language here of transforming communities. So I welcome anyone to, I don't have a question, couldn't get to a question, just wanted to add that as a comment.
Can I say something? I really appreciate these last two comments and questions about why we don't know the things that we don't know and what we can do to know them. I do think it is too easy to say in terms of like any of these memory projects. Okay, we did that, and it's over, and let's move on. Because my big fear at Georgetown has been that everything that we did almost 10 years ago will just fade away. And 10 years from now, we're going to have to do it all over again because people will have forgotten, both through that kind of inertial loss of memory, but also the kind of forced amnesia and suppression of information that I think many people have been alluding to. But at a university, these are communities that are continually renewed every year. Every year we have a crop of new students who don't know anything about this. And unless we teach them, they're not going to know anything about this. That's also true of new faculty who come in, new staff who come in. Our communities are continually being kind of renewed and replenished. And that means we have to keep teaching this over and over, or else it's going to be forgotten. So that's one reason why I'm quite proud of this new class that we have at Georgetown. This class is the reason why I can't be with you today in person, because I have my discussion section later this afternoon, where we're going to talk about some of the founding documents from Georgetown. But this is a class called Race, Power, and Justice at Georgetown. It's a 6-week, 1-credit class that we're running every incoming undergraduate through in their first year. And one piece of this class, it's only one piece of this class, is Georgetown's history of slavery and post-slavery forms of racist discrimination. It's kind of the first week. So it's a big week. But from there, we go on to other topics like Georgetown's relationship to Washington, D.C. today, questions of justice that arise with Georgetown as a global institution. What is the meaning of faith that does justice, especially when it comes to questions of race? So issues of history and values that are deeply tied to Georgetown's mission as a Jesuit and Catholic university, which we share this with Loyola and many other Jesuit and Catholic universities. So I think it's a bold experiment. We'll see how it works. It's a course with immense logistical challenges just to teach all of these students. But I think the idea is a good one. Because if we don't, it really doesn't matter like what you name buildings or what memorials you put up, or even, what books we write. If people don't read them, if people don't know what the history is behind these things, if people just walk past these landmarks every day without thinking twice about them. So ultimately, I think our obligation as scholars is to try to find ways to teach people what we know. So that's my pep talk.
With that, a final word, Dr. Mendoza, Dr. Harris, and Dr. Henfield, last word goes to you.
I wanted to get back to the whole of why don't we know things and how important institutions can be in making people know these things. And I think it's quite, lovely that we're here at a Jesuit institution, because I believe that Jesuit institutions have an important role to play in making this history widely known. This history is uncomfortable. This history can be considered threatening. This history is inconvenient. Some people may say that it is bad for enrollment and for the economy and all these things, right? But there needs to be a reckoning that is not only about like researching this or publishing this, but talking about what does this mean. I tell to my students, for example, I once saw a record of a student at Georgetown College who paid their tuition with the labor of an enslaved child. This person that paid the tuition with the labor of an enslaved child, who was unnamed in the records, became a leader of the Jesuit order in the United States. I do not know what happened to that child. But that to me expresses how issues such as like income inequality, being able to know your history, and many problems that exist today are part or are the result of this history. And therefore, if we think that Jesuit institutions, or if we actually believe what they say, that they are training men and women for the service of others, that not only for themselves, this is something that needs to be leaned into, that needs to be taught. And if there's something to be learned about this panel is how, like that history that, we study in records and that we try to bring to the public lives with us here in this room today. It's not there in the past where we can leave it and it's uncomfortable, but the result of this history is here with us today. It's here, there at Georgetown, and the streets that people walk, and in the buildings that are named now for different people. And we need to reckon with it if we are truly going to achieve the things that we like to think that we're going to achieve in Jesuit institutions, right? To work for the greater glory of God, right? So that would be my gist to end my part of the conversation.
First, I'm just very grateful to be here this morning and that you're all here. Second, I have to say that when the Georgetown projects took off, at that time I thought, that's really interesting. As someone who grew up Catholic, I thought there could be a real opportunity to put this whole conversation in a different context. And you quite beautifully, as well as many of the comments today, indicate that sense of something larger than just the institution, that you have a higher moral mission. And so I really still have a lot of hope that our Catholic institutions, Jesuit institutions, can lead more in this larger project. That, of course, within your own institutions, you're in a moment of great change on all kinds of fronts. I was just reading about the LA Archdiocese having to pay close to $1 billion for very contemporary inequity. So we're often managing contemporary huge issues with the longer term issues. But just the way that you spoke and many of the comments today indicate the special role that I think Jesuit institutions can have. And I loved hearing also what Adam says. I think Adam, that course is the first time that there's been a required course that I know of on this history, and making it part of the larger mission of the university. That is something that secular institutions struggle much more with, and that you come to organically. So I just grateful to be here this morning and to engage in this conversation and to think about the particular role that you have and what you can do both for this issue but also for our nation.
Yeah, I mostly said what I wanted to say, but I just want to echo Professor Harris that it's really an honor to be here and to engage in this conversation across Jesuit universities, because I really agree with what Elsa and Leslie said. I mean, I think Jesuit universities, with their specific mission and history, have a unique role to play in helping all of us, I think, reckon with our histories. So those are my last words.
Thanks so much. I'm not I told you so person, but I told you that this was going to be a great panel with great guests and that you'd learn a lot. And I'd like to address the elephant in the room, that Loyola, University of Chicago, is obviously a Jesuit Catholic university, and there's a lot about our own history that we do not know. So I would like to challenge, and I don't think it will be very hard for you to accept this challenge, Mike. I'd like to challenge both of our organizations to continue this conversation and figure out exactly what are the tangible things that we can do at the Institute for Racial Justice and at the Hank Center to think about policies and practices right here at home. I'll speak to the Institute for Racial Justice specifically. We spend a lot of our time and energy focused on Chicagoland area and not as much focused on Loyola. This inspiration, this conversation today really inspired me to start thinking twice about that approach. And even if it's something small, and what really inspired me was that so much of the work, it sounds like you all did, started as a small project that kind of grew over time. So why can't we do that? Why not Loyola? If not in Chicago, then where? So yeah, I'd like to challenge the Hank Center. And certainly accept it here on behalf of the Institute for Racial Justice to at the very least figure out what are some small things that we can do to move the conversation forward into action. So thank you all for your attention. Looking forward to hearing from you all soon.